All right, Leigh, Beyond Bias. This is where you and I get to role model critical thinking and help people think a bit deeper on some issues and get that a little bit closer to the truth. Last time we spoke about rights versus responsibilities and tried to pull apart some of the psychology and issues surrounding rights versus responsibilities. What are we going to talk about today?
So obviously we've been chatting since then, and we've kind of seen that there was so much in that last topic that now we're going to look to go into this mini series, and we've actually looked at society and the functioning of society as a whole. We're keen to dive into what are those key areas, what are those key sort of concepts within society, our society in particular in the West, that make it necessary to function, even at a bare minimum. So we're really keen to dive into that, and what better to start with than free speech. And obviously there's so many things to go through in free speech as a topic, and we've got a bunch of articles in the news, journal articles, all that sort of thing to go through. But disclaimer at the start, we're not going to be able to get through this all in one podcast, but we're going to do our best to sort of tackle those big ticket items and talk about this cultural moment, like right now, what we're experiencing right now, and kind of just look at the biases, try and reflect on our own biases coming into this, what lens we're actually seeing through, but also just look at the ideologies that are kind of undergirding this challenge toward free speech and sort of suggesting that there is a limit to this thing called free speech. So those are just a couple of things that I guess we're going to unpack today. There's so many places where we could start.
There are. Where do you want to start, Leigh? Because there's so many rabbit holes we can go down with this one.
Yeah, maybe we could even just start on, like, I guess the problem statement or the problem thesis of what's happening. So obviously, free speech is the ability for you and I, anyone in society, to be able to speak their mind on any given topic, and the ability to think primarily. And we know that there's a concept in psychology called psychological safety, and that sort of relates quite closely to this. It's usually used in organisations, but in practice, with I guess personal conversations, it's that not ability, but that safety to be able to take interpersonal risks without being punished. It's a ground where you can express new ideas and feel safe to do so. And obviously there's a lot of environments now, especially online, where that isn't the case, quite obviously. And we can talk about aspects where we probably self-censor ourselves in ways. But maybe we could start with, we were talking even just before about Joe Rogan and his, recently signed this, I think $100 million deal with Spotify to move his whole podcast platform over there. And we've seen even in that transition that he's, not all the podcasts have followed over. One's like Alex Jones, who's quite a controversial figure, and a few others like, I think, maybe Miley Yiannopoulos, that didn't sort of, the podcast didn't come over to the platform, and it was I think it was sort of labelled as like a clerical error, something like that. But it seems that all of the ones that are mildly controversial didn't make it on there. And now, just a couple of days ago, we've seen that the Spotify employees are starting this kind of internal case against Joe to sort of protest him being on the platform. And they're actually wanting editorial oversight on his podcast. So they're challenging his free speech. There's been multiple cases where people have sort of either been fired from their jobs, or sort of had, I guess like a forced resignation, like we've seen even in like media companies, like we've seen Barry Weiss from the New York Times kind of forcibly resigned.
Well, I think even recently here in Australia with Israel Folau is a big one.
Exactly. Yeah, so we're seeing these cases arise all over the world, and I've got the article here about Barry Weiss as well, and how she was actually like personally attacked online as it happened. She says that there were people who behind closed doors said, I'm so sad to see you go, all these kind of things. But then they posted on the Twitter with axe emojis and just these spiteful comments. So there's this dichotomy between things that happen behind closed doors and things that are happening online, and I guess the character difference, because people are scared to go against the grain or sort of align with people's ideas, because as we were just talking, even just prior to this podcast, that the ideas are separate to people. But people aren't scared to even align with someone who, they may have had an idea that's that they don't agree with, or that's controversial online. So maybe you could unpack that. I know that's something you've been thinking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, free speech, right? It is so, it's kind of fundamental to this whole Western democratic society. Is the ability for you to put forward your ideas on how, if we just look at kind of take the societal functioning kind of aspect and how free speech plays out in that arena, which, ultimately today is kind of like politics, right? In that, for a democracy to work, you need to have certain people be able to put, this is how I think we should run the country, and here are the social problems that we have. These are the solutions that I think we should pursue in order to solve those problems. And and then you have other people that present their ideas, and then they put it to the people, they vote, and that's how we get the political government of the day that goes about carrying out that mandate. So, free speech ultimately is kind of at the foundational levels, one of the things that make our democratic society work, right? And so there's so many benefits from coming from that. And then you kind of ask, what are the preconditions for free speech to work? If that's kind of part of the function from a political societal point of view, and there's so many other benefits that will go out into other aspects, whether later on as we talk, whether it's in the academic world, or whether it's in the private sector or whatever. But what are the kind of preconditions for free speech to actually work? And as I was thinking about it, it really is this whole idea of being able to separate the person from the idea. For you to have free speech, you have to be able to gauge in dialogue, and therefore to gauge in dialogue, you have to respect the other person, and you may not always agree with their idea. But you need to, as Ravi Zacharias says, you need to learn to disagree without being disagreeable, which I think is this really great sort of concept, and ultimately it comes down to valuing the other person, and Ravi Zacharias again, another quote of his, great thinker, great. Christian apologist and whatnot, but great thinker, and he says that all people are equal, but all ideas are not. All right, and I think you have to kind of, for free speech to actually work, you have to start from a basis of the person that I'm speaking to has inherent value in and of themselves, and therefore because they have value, I need to respect them. I need to, care for them and that sort of thing. And then let's talk about the idea. All right. And I may not agree with the idea. I may disagree with it strongly. But that doesn't mean I'm going to attack you, the person, because as soon as I start to do that, the dialogue starts to break down. Okay. And I think one of the things that I see today is this inability of people to separate the issue or the idea from the person. And because they can do that, we're not valuing the people, and therefore we're, and attacking the idea, we're starting to attack the person. And when you start to think about that and you follow that through, right? What's the result of being unable to separate? And you think, well, okay, so I don't agree with that idea. Okay, so I'm not separating the person and the idea. So therefore, I don't agree with the idea. I think that's a bad idea. But because I haven't separated the idea from you as a person, because I think that's a bad idea, I therefore think you're a bad person. Okay. Now, that's the implication. There's a whole lot of ramification. That totally changes the way that I now think about you, the way that I perceive you, the way that I interact with you, because I now think you're a bad person. And so when that happens, there's a number of things that kind of the flow on, right? I'm now no longer trying to convince you of my idea. I don't think that you're worthy of hearing my idea. I don't necessarily want you on my team. I'm not trying to convince you so that you're now on my side of the argument, because I think you're a bad person. I don't want you on my side of the argument. So I'm not going to try and convince you. I'm going to try and attack you. And therefore it becomes this almost perceived, I'm right, you're wrong. I'm good, you're evil. And it becomes this battle of good versus evil. And so rather than attacking the idea, I'm trying to overcome and battle evil, which is you, the person. And therefore, it becomes personal, right? It really does become personal. I think the other side of things is, if you're a bad person, then it's because I'm not trying to convince you anymore. I'm not trying to win you over to my side, because you're a bad person. I don't see that you're worthy of respect. I don't see that you're worthy of being treated, given the rights and the respect that I would want, or that someone who thinks like me deserves. And therefore, I don't give you the opportunity to change your mind either, because you're a bad person. Even if you change your mind, you don't deserve a second chance. And so there's no forgiveness. The whole concept of grace, forgiveness, and actually giving people a second chance is totally taken away. And I think that I was having a conversation just the other day around it was actually around Paul Pasali. So Paul Pasali's recently come out, and it was an interview with him, and basically he was saying that everything I ever did to start out was for Ipswich, and even right to the end, he was working incredibly hard for the city of Ipswich, and being someone who's lived in Ipswich under his mayorship, I saw so much good that he was doing, but he actually said, as I became so successful, my ego got in the way, and as a result of that, did a whole lot of things that he shouldn't have done, and obviously he's had his fall and done his time and paid his penance. And as I was thinking and listening to what he was saying, I'm like, so many people who are really successful and then have that fall, when they come back for the second chance, because they're so much wiser, they've learnt so much, they can now keep their ego in check, they're much more humble, they actually achieve a lot more impact on the second go. Right? Happens in business all the time with businessmen going bankrupt and then coming back and building a much bigger and successful business. But in today's culture, Paul Pasali will never get an opportunity to come back and have a second crack and actually achieve much more impact. And whether or not you think that's right or wrong, it's kind of the reality now. That his potential, or he won't be given the opportunity to have a second chance. And I think that's what happens so often when this whole free speech thing is people, they're not given an opportunity to change their mind. They're not given a second chance to have a crack at putting an idea out there and pursue an ideology or an issue or whatever it is. They're just totally slain at the knees right from the word go, and they're not given that opportunity to change, have another, grow, all that sort of stuff.
Totally. Yeah.
So there's a few thoughts around separating the person from the idea. What's your take on it?
Well, I just want to jump in with that cognitive distortion of dichotomous thinking, of which is all or nothing thinking, and just the idea that many of these people view these issues on a group level, and as soon as you have dichotomous thinking on a group level and this level of identity, you're gonna it's the death of nuance. You're gonna ignore the individual in front of you. It's no longer an individual issue. It's an issue of the group. And so I'm not going to look at the individual as someone that has nuance, someone that has like anything outside of like this us versus them, all versus nothing paradigm. And we know that is an ideology in itself, and that a lot of these particular battles around free speech, there's an ideology that's underpinning it called Marxism. Where there is in a lot of cases it's at the level of group identity, and there's this class that is oppressed and a class that is the oppressor, and a lot of the times the people who are sort of going on that crusade to right perceived wrongs to get the oppressor, because they're looking at it through that dichotomous thinking lens, they will not see nuance. Because they're on a crusade in the name of their group, and so they won't see individuals. But we know that on the basis of that Western thought you were talking about before, that everyone is created in the image of God, there's something completely unique about every individual that is so just divine about their potential that it should be respected. And therefore, everyone should honour their potential by giving them the time of day and letting them, speak their mind and act out their potential. But when you look at things through that group lens, you're not going to see the individual, and you're going to purposely kill nuance. And, this is reinforced by so many things, like even just for starters, the election cycles. Like obviously everything's been politicized over the last 10 years. You look at in America, Democrats and Republicans, since that in itself is dichotomous thinking, there's only two parties, it forces people into the corner of dogma. Even if people have this huge nuance and positions online, obviously you've got the echo chamber. People get, in an election year, people get kind of edgy about, what they stand for. And you move into that kind of defensive role where, normally they would have so much nuance in their position, and it's not a left versus right issue. We know it's so much bigger than that. We know that like people can have conservative angles on one side and progressive angles on the other. People can have conservative economic beliefs and progressive beliefs about climate change, all these certain things. It's like there's so much nuance. We know this, but then we know that when it comes to election year, there's going to be so much dogma placed in your positions because you come in this defense mode. You move into the kind of banners of what's being put on for whatever political party that you just kind of align with, and you're forced into group identity, whereas you were an individual and you still are an individual, but you have to reconcile that, it's kind of better for me at this point to align with my group identity, because if I go as an individual, I risk ground being lost on the group level sort of thing. But I kind of think that's a false sort of narrative as well. I don't think it's really true. I think the best thing that could happen is if everyone came back down to that individual level and talked it through, the nuance, like encourage that nuance, and that we sort of had a bottom-up approach to change the political narrative. I mean, Eric Weinstein, who you would know as well, he had a great thought around having, and this will never happen, but having two people run for president, one on the centre left, one on the centre right, and they both agree, signed on a contract. If we win, I'm going to do the first term, you're going to do the second term. So that it's literally a bipartisan agreement. And I just think that would be so great for America and the West. To have something like that put into the political mechanism. Approach. Yeah, very radical. And as I said, it's not going to happen because there's too much money in the democratic process, in the DNC and the RNC and that sort of thing. But what are your thoughts about that? About I guess that sort of ideology of Marxism that has creeped in, that encourages that all or nothing thinking at the group level, and kind of like, how do we combat that? How do we bring it down to that nuance on the individual level?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say that the issues of free speech and the attack on free speech, I think, if Marxism is kind of one of the parties that's attacking it today, but you look throughout history and the attacks on free speech have come from a much broader array of ideologies, I guess, than just Marxism. Today, when we think about where those attacks are coming from in the current time, a lot of them are, you would align them to, either they align themselves or you actually look at it objectively, and the outcomes that they're trying to pursue and the lines of argument that they are articulating it very much aligned to the historical Marxist approach. So what do I think about the group side of things, and how do we combat it? Well, I think, from the perspective of what you were saying, is bring it back down to the individual and have, start at the individual level and then kind of work your way back up is, very much aligned to what Jordan Peterson was saying, right? When he writes in 12 Rules for Life. Make sure that your own house is in order before you start criticising the world. And start taking individual responsibility. And ultimately, one of the things that happens when, as you're talking about the group kind of forces there, it begins to polarize, right? And so you get more and more extreme. And so, the tribalism occurs, but also the arguments occur. We spoke last time around echo chambers and confirmation bias, and you're surrounding yourself by your group, and so you're only hearing kind of their influences on your thinking, and vice versa on the other side of things, and it really just pull things apart. Some of Jonathan Haidt's research in that area is, really shows the polarization, particularly in America, but, here in Australia and around the world as well. And so how do you combat that? Well, ultimately the group is made up of individuals. And so if the group norm, the normal behavior within the group is going to shift, and ultimately that happens by individuals changing their behavior, and then collectively that change at the individual level creates a new norm, a new normal behavior, and shifts the behavior, back to kind of what we're talking around. And so at the individual level, it kind of has to happen where individuals say, hey, I'm gonna talk about the issue with you. I'm gonna sit down and have a conversation. I'm gonna have dialogue. We're gonna talk about the issue, but I'm not gonna attack you as a person. And I value you as a person. And it's amazing when you look around the world and you see the really good ideological thinkers and philosophers and people that actually kind of promote this. They actually build friendships with people that sit on the other side of the fence, because they're talking about ideas and they're valuing the person. And because that's so rare today, people actually value that. If you can actually sit there and say, hey, I still value you. I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to validate you as a person. I'm going to have an intellectual conversation. I'm going to push you. I'm going to promote my ideas and challenge yours, but I'm not going to challenge you as an individual. That's such a rare thing to happen these days.
It's so much more interesting.
Well,
it's so uninteresting to just have someone attacking the person, just an ad hominem attack or the straw man. Like, it's not interesting to see that. It's not an intellectual battle, but when you see people really having it out intellectually, and it's kind of like, you see, it's just two brains just going at it. It's fascinating to watch. Like, I mean, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson, that 2 or 3 part series, I think it was in 2018, end of 2018, I just... you're on the edge of the seat just trying to follow what these guys are doing, and it's fascinating, but you don't see it happen too often. No,
that's right. But you look at that. I mean, Jordan Peterson and Ruben. Ruben's on the other side of the spectrum in so many ways from his political views, but he toured with Peterson. They become really close friends.
And Shapiro and Ruben. Like Shapiro said, like originally, he stood against like things like gay marriage and stuff, and has moved to like a more sort of liberal view, but like they disagree on so many things, but they model this relationship of we can separate the idea from the person. It's great.
Well, I mean, you think back. I think it was might have been Carl Rogers, who said that listening done well is the most valuable thing you can do for a person. It's the how you show the most value to another person. And when you think about people listen these days to respond, they don't listen to understand, and that kind of concept there is so key to free speech, being able to stop and actually listen and try and understand the other side of the argument. That is so rare, and so when you find someone who does that, that's a special thing, right? Because they are communicating to you that you are valuable to them. They are imparting value to you by listening to try and understand. And so those type of relationships that we're talking about with those thinkers, where that happens at the high level, is really important. But ultimately, there's no reason why that shouldn't be being played out at the common level. It should be the Friday night conversations around the barbecue, or the Saturday afternoon on the footy sideline. Conversations about important issues should be producing friends rather than it's kind of like that age-old thing. Never talk about religion, politics, or how you raise your kids. But ultimately it's those conversations that, if done well, bring people together and unify and strengthen relationships and friendships rather than divide. It's only when you cannot separate the individual from the issue, that they become really divisive. And so I think that ability to separate is really at the heart of all sort of free speech issues.
Totally. And even deep diving just on the listening well piece, it's like you actually have to do that. And like, I'm not just listening to your speech, I'm like observing your body language, everything, the cues, the speed at which you're talking, like deep diving into the psychology of that. I've got like a paper on that to understand people's positions like properly, like listening is key. Like the perceptual process to understand how deep that is. Like I'll just get a couple of things out here. So just interpersonal conversations. There's distinct perceptual, cognitive, and motivational processes taking place like every time we do this. And an individual who is sensitive must first sense and perceptually discriminate various stimuli in his or her surroundings. And for example, if John's wife rolls his eyes in disgust at the breakfast table, but John doesn't notice it because he happens to be looking down at the newspaper when it occurs, his understanding of his immediate social environment will be compromised. And interpersonal sensitivity starts with sensation and perception. Thus, interpersonal sensitivity is a function of A, one's opportunities to experience and interact with the environment, B, their attention, and C, any constraints on the perceptual system with respect to the range of stimuli one can detect and process. Any process that influences these three aspects of interpersonal sensation and perception will necessarily affect interpersonal sensitivity.
So why don't you translate that? You and I'll understand. Some people listening probably won't.
So what that means is, if I close my eyes, if I'm on the other end and I'm just listening to this on audio, like there is so many things I'm missing in the social environment that would give me cues to exactly what you're saying and how you're saying it, the intensity at which you're saying and expressing it. And, if we don't do that listening well piece and, paying attention to the person that we're with, we're not actually fully understanding or perceiving correctly, because this free speech piece, it has to come back to you're genuinely, accurately perceiving the person and what they're saying. So it's like there has to be some sort of truth in the way that I am perceiving the conversation. Now, I can only have that if I'm completely respecting you by listening and paying attention to what you're saying. If I miss a bunch of that context, there's no way that there's accuracy behind my perception. So I think just putting that into it as well, and just kind of unpacking a little bit about the psychology of perception within this free speech piece.
Well, I think before we kind of go there, you almost to kind of take that idea that you were just talking around trying to understand the other person's perspective, and what's the purpose of doing that? And what is the purpose of free speech? Yes, we've kind of spoken around the kind of the function that it plays in terms of the political system, and it has a function in terms of other aspects of society. But what's the kind of purpose of it? And ultimately, it is to have a conversation, to put some ideas together, to find out what is the best idea, what is the closest to the truth, whatever that may be that we're talking about. What is true? If you're talking about an ideology around how the world works, what is the truth around that? Let's have a conversation to try and get as close as we can to how the world actually works. Whether that's with people, or the best way to run a society, the best way to solve a problem. We're trying to figure out, what's the, at kind of the high metaphysical side of things. We want to get to the closest thing of the truth. And
Absolutely.
I think so many people these days, they go into a dialogue not to find out what the best idea is or what is the, to get that little bit closer to the truth. They're going into a dialogue with the purpose of progressing their own ideology or their own perspective and idea, not to refine that in any way, not to understand the other person's, to test their idea and see if it stands up in the marketplace of ideas and against challenges and that sort of thing. Not to grow personally, they just want to progress theirs and minimize other people, minimize challenge to their idea. And ultimately that's kind of what people should be doing, is they want to say, hey, here's an idea, here's an ideology, challenge it as much as possible, so that we can, ultimately, if it's a good one,
it's going to stand
that
up.
challenge will strengthen it, and strengthen your conviction in it, and strengthen its influence on the world. But people want to kind of progress their ideology and remove challenge in these days, which kind of is the opposite in terms of the purpose of this whole free speech kind of concept.
Yeah, well, I guess that kind of goes straight into the idea of this term of microaggressions that's kind of come up in the late 90s, 1970s or something, and this idea that words can be violence. This idea of emotional violence that is completely different to emotional abuse and verbal abuse. It's this idea that the consequences of holding certain ideas perpetuate something that is so dangerous that it must be censored. It started as, the microaggressions and words as violence started as an idea that, aggressive words are part of the event structure leading to violence, which is true. If someone's going to have a fight, generally there's probably going to be words between each other before that fight. But the idea that there is nothing physical happening where it's moved to, it's pivoted to that, is just it moves into the realm of insanity, and that we have to pretend that these ideologies are so evasive, so consequentially dangerous that you can't hold them. So just to be able to explain it, like I've got a explanation of verbal violence online. So verbal violence or verbal aggression is an exchange of messages between two people where at least one person in the dyad, which is group, or two people, attacks the self-concept of the other person in order to hurt the person psychologically. So that's one definition of it. That's a more sort of believable definition. There's others that are far more directed at certain ideologies. But I mean, even that one, it's just, we need to understand the subjectivity of motive and how, we can only know our own motives. We can't do this thing where we play the game of ascribing motive to someone else and then attacking them because, we're playing out the role of mind reader. And that's one of the other cognitive distortions that is just so counterproductive.
Which
mind
comes
reading.
Well, that's right. But ultimately it comes from that
initial goal.
I'm not willing to listen to understand.
Yeah.
I'm going to listen only so I can respond because I know what you're thinking anyway, right? And how ridiculous is that?
Initially discrediting them like as a bad actor at the start. And, this kind of ideology is what really concerns me about the future of free speech.
Yeah.
And, there's so many sort of different aspects of where this goes.
Yeah.
But one in particular, a recent one, is around critical race theory, which is, there is just such a small amount of people that truly believe what that is. But I feel like just people don't know what it is.
Well, I think so. Here's I think the issue that you are covering there is when we start talking about free speech and attacks on free speech. There's kind of two real approaches that I see. One is kind of the censorship, and we're just going to there's the whole cancel culture. We're just not going to allow you to speak. All right, so we're going to remove your ability to put your idea forward.
Yeah.
And the other one is at a more kind of the societal level that you're tapping into, is we're going to start to control language, and therefore. So, what we're saying here around violence, how the definition of violence and what people consider as violence has been shifted over time.
Yeah.
Let's change the definition of a word, so that we can bring a whole lot of other connotations in. And so what you're actually doing, which and we're going to make you again. It kind of makes you look a bad person because you're doing something bad, even though you're not. You're doing something that people have been doing for thousands of years.
Yeah.
The other one. So you brought violence there. The other one to me that has really kind of crept through is trauma. And this is kind of the concept behind a lot of the cancel culture particularly in campuses, in
safe spaces,
safe space, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But because listening to your idea is going to be traumatic to me,
catastrophizing.
And so Jonathan Haidt in one of his books talks about the change of definition of trauma. What constituted trauma? What was psychologically defined as trauma back in the 60s is very different to what they classify as trauma today. Even today. So the actual DSM diagnostic statistic manual that we classify mental illness and orders in today, it said trauma for something to classify trauma, it requires an actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And I think and obviously in so much in the ideological arena where we're talking about, there's no actual violence going on. There's no actual death or injury being occurring, or it shouldn't. Obviously, there's kind of the what happens in terms of the riots and things, which we might talk about a bit later. But it's that threatened. What constitutes threatened these days is really interesting. And when you think about it, it's so feeling threatened. So many these days. What threatens people these days is the bar for what is threatening has been lowered so much for so many people. And ultimately you can look at that and you think, well, people's lives no longer kind of live in the extreme of experiences, right? So back 100 years ago, people would experience, if you just take temperature, right? People would experience extreme cold and extreme heat. They didn't have the heating and thermoregulation that we have in buildings these days. Clothes weren't as effective as warming, so people would tolerate much more of the extremes. Whereas these days, we like to be comfortable, okay? And so we like to have this very narrow temperature range of what we experience. And kind of there's a whole movement with Wim Hof at the moment going, getting people to physically experience more extremes so that their body is actually functioning a whole lot better. because their body's used to dealing with those sort of extremes, that because they're more capable outside of the comfort zone, it becomes even more capable inside the comfort zone, right? The same concept happens psychologically. People have this comfort zone which has become really narrow, because we don't like the extremes. People like a comfortable life, and that plays out in so many areas. People haven't had, particularly the upcoming generations. This is one of the things that I think may be a positive out of COVID, is it is an actual really hard societal event, that it is a form of hardship. But you look at our grandparents who came through the Great Depression, and the psychological pressures that had at the individual, at the family, at the national and the global kind of societal levels. That was really hard time, and so people were able to as a result, they can become a whole lot more resilient, and that sort of thing. Yeah. So once they worked really hard, and the economy and the world kind of recovered from that, what then was hard for them is very different. They worked, because they went through so much that was uncomfortable. They worked really hard for their kids to not have to experience what was so comfortable. Me personally, my dad pretty much grew up under the poverty line, but he made a decision at the age of 13 that his kids were not going to have, or that were going to have the opportunities that he didn't have as a kid, and so he worked really hard. And became a successful medical specialist and doctor, and he provided us with everything. And so I haven't had to go through what was hard for him in terms of that sort of thing. And so up until I went into the military, what was difficult for me, I look back at that sort of thing, and I'm like, that it was nothing at all. And that's one of the things that I've learned from my time in the military, was that my frame of reference as to what is hard is so different to so many other people these days. What they think is hard, what they think is extreme, is just that's just a walk up a hill. So
it's funny with exposure therapy that we know the evidence of that. If you're in a controlled environment, and you're exposed to like consecutive, increases in the intensity of whatever the stimulus is that you're kind of uncomfortable to, that you will become resilient and actually more comfortable with what that is.
It's the whole process of growth, right? But kind of to get back to the trauma, people don't experience hardship these days, so anything that now threatens their comfort zone, they experience as threatening. And because you think about our physiological systems within our body, they're designed to keep us safe, from physical threat. If you subscribe to the kind of the evolutionary sort of theory, then it's caveman, saber-toothed tiger in the bush. That's going to get that's what's threatening. Today we obviously live in a very physically safe environment, particularly in the Western world. We don't have saber-toothed tigers. We don't have people trying to kill us. And so our physiological systems are triggered by things that are so much less threatening than what they would have a lot previous in times past. Yeah. And so therefore what we perceive as threatening has become the standard for what is threatening. The bar,
different baseline,
is very much a different baseline, and therefore the definition of trauma is so different. It's one of the reasons why in Stoic philosophy, they would say, go and experience the hardship. And so that you don't have to. Ultimately, there's kind of the difference between resilience and mental toughness, right? As far as I see it and I define it, is that resilience is your ability to bounce back and engage in coping skills and all that sort of stuff. Mental toughness is really it's shifting the frame of reference as to what is hard and where you need to engage those coping mechanisms and the resilience skills. And so if you can push that bar where you, or the line in the sand where you need to start engaging coping skills further to the extreme, you're going to have a much wider range of what is threatening, what is not. And so, trauma is one of those things that has crept in. And ultimately, I think for the majority of people, the masses, they don't notice that sort of thing. But for the people that are intentional about these sort of things, they do try and control the language, and they try and change what terms and words mean, and they're intentional about that because ultimately, if you control language, you control thought, and this is where it kind of, for a lot of people, they don't think things through deeply, and they don't realize that, hey, by controlling my speech, they're actually telling me what to think. And that's kind of the big thing in it's the crazy thing, the incoherent thing around academia. They say we wanted to encourage people how to think, not what to think, but we're not going to allow them to talk about X, Y, and Z. But when you ultimately can you have thought without language? Is one of those. It was a question that, discussion that you kind of have in your first semester of psychology, right? And ultimately, language is how you articulate your thoughts, is how you express your thoughts. Now, if you're kind of told that you can't, or if we change the meaning of words and the words that you use to a thing, that means we're influencing the way that you think. Well, this word now means that. So when you think this word, and when you talk about this word, you actually have to think about the concept or whatever it is you're talking about in this particular way. Or if you're not allowed to speak about that particular thing, then the implication is that you can't talk about it because it's wrong. And if it's wrong, you shouldn't be thinking it either. So again, it's trying to control what people think as much as what they say and what they do, and that's a really dangerous place to end up.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The control on word architecture that's sort of emerged, and we're seeing this huge influence of the professors that sort of came through. The 1970s, 1980s, and a real resurgence of their literature. Like stuff that was kind of fringe in that time because it was such a crazy time through the 70s and 80s that's kind of moved mainstream now. And, the idea that a lot of the meaning behind these words is actually just getting completely eroded because no one really knows what they mean anymore. Because they've been misconstrued so many times, and people are aware that there's kind of, bad actors in a way that are kind of misconstruing the meaning of these words or changing the architecture of the words to mean certain things in certain ways, and they can see that, but there's no sort of way of challenging it because that kind of fringe is now the mainstream. It's now sort of controlling a lot of thought and ideas in the media, but I thought it was important that one of those fringe ideas that has risen that came out in the 90s by a guy called Harris about critical race theory. It's something that really concerned me, and I know I'll cop stuff about this because of how contentious the issue is. But I think putting these ideas in the open is just so important. So Critical race theory operates on three basic premises: that racism is pervasive, that racism is permanent, and that racism must be challenged. But central to critical race theory is the notion that racism is a pervasive, systemic condition, not merely an individual individual pathology, sorry. Racism is a vast system that structures our institutions and relationships. Second, racism adapts to socio-cultural changes by altering its expression, but it never diminishes or disappears. Finally, critical race theorists hold that scholarship that challenges social inequities must take into account systemic racism and must counter positivist notions of neutral, colourblind inquiry. And that last sentence is we'll unpack that a bit more, because that last sentence is pretty much saying, if you treat someone like the pigment of their skin isn't, doesn't sort of release a bias on you to treat them differently, then that thought needs to be challenged, and that is racism. So they come from the idea that whiteness itself is a property that perpetuates racism. And so it's never going away as long as there are white people that are alive. So things like this that are extremely fringe ideas, you just know that since in the theory itself, it's mentioned that it is never going away. This is something permanent. It cannot be fixed. So people will crusade for their whole lives to no end on this. And we know just by the demographics of the liberal arts in universities in America and in Australia and in the West, that this is predominantly actually white liberals. And the data's in on this. I've got articles to support all of this right here. And so we've got this minority group carrying these fringe theories that have been perpetuated by professors through the 70s and 80s that have now moved to the mainstream, that are actually insolvable by definition. You cannot solve these.
No.
But they'll continue to erode at speech and fight the crusade, and it will turn into riots and that sort of thing because it's what they believe. And so I think it's kind of important for us to kind of steelman our own positions and their side and try and understand, why these riots happening. And if you truly believed this, then that crusade would be, that's the meaning of your life. Like, to fight this, to try and get rid of this.
Let's follow it through. Essentially what we're saying is that whiteness is inherently perpetuates racism. Okay? And so these people that fight these crusades, they ultimately are sort of saying, well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to eradicate racism, right? So if whiteness inherently perpetuates racism, then what's the solution to racism? There is none other than eradicating the white people in the world. Right? If you actually take it through,
or killing their credibility to hold any kind of idea.
Yep.
It is coming out in violence with Antifa and all these different places.
But even as long as white people exist, racism is going to be perpetuated. That's what that ideology
they believe.
says.
Yes.
And so the only solution to the problem viewed through that lens is to eradicate what inherently perpetuates the problem. Okay, and that is to get rid of every single white person, which is a crazy incoherent argument, particularly as you were saying, that it's held and perpetuated, majoritarily by white people,
white liberals,
liberals.
And it's all or nothing thinking again. And it's extremely important to say that is such a fringe belief, and that in the protests that did just take place with George Floyd and a couple of things that followed there, the protests, like there were so many, like a majority of people that went out to protest were legitimately protesting issues that they strongly feel about. They didn't, like, I can say with confidence that they didn't believe in this specific thing.
Correct.
But the people that really kind of eroded at the legitimacy of their cause was Antifa and the rest of the people that came and actually started rioting and smashing property in the name, because, you know, a lot of other stuff comes into it in terms of like the end of this too is that it can't be changed. It has to be burnt to the ground. So the system itself has to be burnt to the ground. And so that's what we're seeing take place. You know, there's you can't change. You can't make it better. You can't improve it. It literally needs to be burnt to the ground.
Yes.
Yeah.
The crazy thing about people like groups like Antifa is they're not putting an alternative up. They just want to destroy society and the current system. And then what? Okay, they don't necessarily have an alternative. And that's the kind of crazy thing around what is the best way to run society. And they would just say, yeah, but there's problems with this one. Yeah, okay, cool. Open to hearing, but we still want to live together. We still want to, you know, gain all the benefits of having an organised society. How do we organise it otherwise? And groups like that don't have an answer. And that's kind of the crazy thing. And one of the issues that I think in so many of all these society issues that we're discussing is that people don't stop and evaluate their thinking, and they don't think through things to the third, second, third, fourth order effects of the ideas and things that they're kind of following. And how do you think that through? How do you you know, clarify and articulate your thinking and your ideas and actually you know, figure out what it is?
Yeah.
Well, it's through dialogue.
And the cause is perceived.
The speech.
The cause is perceived as so great that it kind of overtakes, you know, the goal to even consider those things. You know, that the people are just on this crusade that it, you know, the issue that is just, you know, obviously blown up so much in election years and that sort of thing. Like, people are just overcome by the angst of like, this is terrible. And the data is also in on individual differences in personality, that these white liberals that have, you know, made these decisions to study these degrees, that's actually something unique about them. They're actually higher in this big five personality trait called agreeableness. And they're higher particularly on the domain of tender-mindedness and compassion. So they feel this deep, like, compassion towards these issues. So the cause is even bigger in their eyes than it is of, you know, a conservative or someone that has a different personality.
I mean, it's a good thing, right? That's a good trait. That's what we want in people. But it's the mechanisms of expression. It's almost like they haven't been taught how to think things through, how to discuss, the value of discussing in order to clarify their ideas so that they can, come to the best way to actually express that compassion and all that sort of thing.
Totally.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, all of these things that we're talking about, they manifest online first, right? Like, the culture is molded online. We see, the mechanism of Twitter just causing this huge outrage amongst people. And so, you know, if we're getting to, I guess, some of the practical points, it's like, do this, like, take it offline and actually talk to the person. You know, use your speech. Use your free speech, like, actually in person, in actual, like, physical context, so that you can actually talk and actually get the full context and nuance. You know, Twitter, even the mechanism of Twitter only, you know, being able to write 250 words or however many it is. I'm not an active Twitter user. But that mechanism itself kills nuance. We know that kills nuance in perspective. People have to put their entire thoughts, their entire ideologies into this small box. The irony that it's in a box, that people's ideas are being put in this small box is just, it's funny in itself. But there just needs to be a space outside of that context in order to actually think things through. Yeah. And it's so much safer, if you've got something like this where you have that psychological safety, you can risk, putting your ideas out there, taking those interpersonal risks with someone else, who can give you feedback, moderate your speech, the whole socialization process that we've been talking about, where, if people are censored, then the society doesn't have the ability to socialize what it is. They don't have the ability to say, that was bad, don't do that again, or, this is the direction you could take this in next time. There's no ability for that. So the consequences for, censoring on society, there's huge implications for that as well.
100%. So, that's something that we haven't really talked about yet, is that whole idea of censorship. And so...
where the line is, yeah.
Where is the line? So, should Nazis, be censored? People like Milo Yiannopoulos.
Yeah.
Should they be censored? Should they be allowed to speak and put their ideas forward? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm still on the line of whatever incites violence. Obviously, even that can be, a pretty hard line at the moment. Almost everyone in Australia has seen the case with the pregnant woman in Melbourne who was kind of, I believe she was starting a rally to sort of protest COVID. And, there's obviously clear restrictions against that in Australia. And so the police actually came to her house and arrested her because she was inciting something that went against the law. So that's a bit of a different case, but still obviously a free speech case.
Which actually, if you look at it, wasn't actually against the law.
Right. Yeah, I haven't looked into that one deep enough.
You look at it, the thing was occurring outside of... So yes, the rally itself was not in line with stage 4 lockdown, which Melbourne was currently in, but that was being organised out in Ballarat, which was not actually under those same sort of rules of lockdown, and it was done on intentionally because it didn't comply in Melbourne, so they did it somewhere where it did, so they could still feel like they were having a voice. And making their argument.
It's so grey, isn't it?
There's a whole lot of stuff if you look into that that much more deeply. It's it's not consistent.
Yeah.
Right. And that's one of the big things. I think when it comes to censorship, I think there is a place for it, ultimately, when you censor someone, the censorship empowers the censored, and it actually disempowers the audience. And that's one of the crazy things. When you think about it, when you censor someone and you say, "Hey, you can't talk about that," what actually happens? Well, the group actually, if you look at history and all the groups that have been censored, they actually thrive. The ideas actually thrive, because they then become a victim of sorts, all right? Because they have had their right to spread their idea taken away from them. And, as a result of that, that generates two things. One, interest. People are like, what's so powerful about this idea that people have had their rights stripped away, that we're not allowed to hear about it? So people actually become more curious in the idea itself. And so they pursue it and try and find out more about it. The other thing it does is it generates support. And that's because people who may not necessarily agree with the idea itself, but they disagree with what's happened to the person who's been censored. That they believe strongly in the rights of that individual, the value of that individual to be able to promote and speak their mind and put their ideas forward. That they will go and then support and campaign and fight for that person based on that principle, rather than agreeance with the idea. And as a result of that, you get kind of momentum behind it. And that's happened in so many different cases. We're both Christian. We know kind of the early church history when Rome tried to quash the church, and it just went ballistic. Same in kind of the underground church in China at the moment. You don't hear about it, but it is just kind of multiplying exponentially under the oppression of the Chinese people. But the same thing happened in with Nazis in Germany before kind of World War II and that sort of thing. There's a whole lot of groups in history where if you actually censor, you're actually saying that, hey, your idea is actually powerful, and ultimately we don't want that idea to spread. And it's ultimately, it comes out of fear, right? We're actually afraid of that idea spreading and becoming influential, so we want to stop the idea spreading. Okay?
It's funny, isn't it?
And we're gonna so censorship is ultimately it's an act of fear, which is really interesting. So kind of going back to when should censorship, where is the place for censorship? David Spanks, who's the chief censor in New Zealand, actually has a TED talk that I listened to, and it was really good. And the TED talk was talking around the Christchurch massacre that was live streamed, and he had the responsibility of watching that and determining whether or not New Zealand was going to censor. And he says, in all situations like this, we've got to look at the principles of censorship. And the first one is that there should be no state censorship. So there is a separation between the censoring body and the state. If anyone from the New Zealand government tried to pressure him or influence his decision as to what would be censored, they lose their job. Right? There's criminal proceedings and all sorts of things. And that's really important, I think, that separation of state censorship. If you don't get that, then you have the things like Korea and China and all that sort of stuff where you only ever hear what the party line is, and therefore your limited thinking, your thinking is just so limited. And then he says, you always protect the right for free speech, is the second principle. And then the third one is only censor when you are limiting harm to society. And so, the decision that he made there was that if, he viewed the live stream of that massacre as a piece of propaganda. And he kind of cites in the video as to, what the evidence for that was. And so it would not only promote the ideology, but also likely to motivate other people to follow out, similar atrocities. And so based on that, because there is the likelihood of perpetuating harm and serious harm to society, he censored that video. And I think that's a really sensible approach. But when we're talking about kind of just ideologies and talking about ideas and what we think is the closest approximation of the truth that we have currently, or what we think the right or the best solution to a particular problem is, the only way to overcome a bad idea or something that we think is a terrible ideology is not to censor it, but to actually bring it out into the open and to publicly defeat it with logic and reason, and to really shine light on it, so it reveals the true nature of that idea, and so that people can actually see and make their own decision at the individual level, and again, bunch of individuals at the collective level, that hey, this is not a good idea, and we're not going to support it, which is what you were kind of saying around the societal acceptance of ideas.
Yeah. I love like the example you used of this employee on YouTube and obviously having to navigate that horrific video of the New Zealand shooting. And I was just thinking back that at that time, I remember seeing a lot of news corporations posting that video, snippets of it. I remember seeing part of it, not the actual kind of shooting itself, but I was interested to just see the video and I guess like you see parts of that and you like majority of the population are I'm completely disgusted by what's happened, and you're kind of in shock, disbelief, like how could a human do something like that? What kind of ideas are they kind of possessed by? But it's also kind of the opportunity to just like feel that and condemn it, to just, a huge degree. And, it's kind of like you see something like that once and you never need to watch it again. It's like you feel the disgust and, you can kind of use that. But I was just thinking about the line with censoring as well. And I was just thinking how, the OG people of kind of censoring the people that have the movie guidelines, the ratings of G, PG, M, MA, R, 18 plus, and they kind of like mapped it onto the lifespan development of people and, the maturation. And I think that that's a really appropriate way to sort of label things. I guess that's kind of approximates to a trigger warning, but it's like you're recommending that that something should be viewed under certain prerequisites and not under others. But you're not censoring it. You're not saying you can't watch this under any circumstances. But you've got R-rated movies. Like obviously, the conditions, the prerequisites for them to be watched are a lot smaller scope than the G rating. And there's a huge benefits in that. Some R-rated movies might have some really deep issues. Sometimes that can have like sexual violence or something like that. But I guess it's the same kind of concept of, like the terrible, horrific things to see in a movie. And, like generally it's something you kind of want to fast forward. But if you experience it, you experience the disgust of like, actually just like hating what that is and being able to kind of, I think that kind of brings into the public dialogue also how much we collectively don't like that. So it's kind of like an opportunity for that too. It's hard to know where the line is, like with that, where it's too terrible to watch. But I think if people have the opportunity to do either or, it's kind of like that utilitarian thinking, that greatest good for the greatest amount of people. There's going to be a very, very, very small part of the population that are going to think, I would go and do that. This is a reason for me to, get permission to go and do something like that. And obviously that must align with a range of different pathologies to be able to be thinking that way. But for most people, it's an opportunity to kind of agree that it's terrible and we shouldn't do it, which I think is a good thing. Yeah.
Seems to be a heavy note to kind of start to wrap up on.
Yeah, well, there was one more thing that I did think we should unpack.
Certainly.
Because I think just obviously moving beyond bias and trying to monitor our own biases, there's a lot of stuff that's coming up now in this cultural moment that is that's on the more progressive side of things. But I think it's important to note that we unpack those things because they're less obvious. But when the right goes too far, it's quite obvious. Like when a country is moving into fascism, for example, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, McCarthyism that happened in the US, where there was kind of like a witch hunt to sort of just get rid of communists by this anti-communist ideology, and people got fired by their jobs, like several people, and that's a version of this dogma that's in on the right. And generally that surfaces in a way that is quite obvious in comparison to the way it surfaces on the other side. So I think that's one of the reasons why we've kind of shed more light on that side of things. But yeah, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that it's absolutely a thing on both sides.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, definitely. You only have to look at the states at the moment, and just their political discourse, and you can see that there's just as much that's occurring on the with all the Trump supporters, and they're all very much aligned to the right. Yeah. They're just as guilty of trying to censor or limit or illegitimize the voices on the left. It was very similar thing happens here in Australia, but just not to the extent I think that happens over in the States, which is really important.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So
to get practical.
To get practical, what do we want people to do, Leigh? Thinking through all of these sorts of things, how we can talk about all of these things all night and all week, but unless people take something away and actually do something with it, it's not necessarily a valuable use of our time or theirs.
I want people to read more. Specifically, I want people to read Thomas Sowell, who's a black intellectual in the States. He's like 92 or 93 now. He's been through all of these different phases of life. He was originally a communist, and saw some issues with his own thinking that he couldn't reconcile, and kind of moved into the centre. But he's got some great books. Discrimination and Disparities is a great book by Thomas Sowell. It's Sowell. So I'd recommend doing that. I think it's just...
Well, I have to admit I haven't read any of his work, so I'll have to
it's
get on it.
Great, but I think like these ideas, they have something to them, and it you can listen to a bunch of podcasts, but if you want the depth of knowledge to actually start getting at the root of some of these ideas, I think it's important to sort of embed yourself in reading and get your own perspective on these things. We've already pushed the having offline conversations, all that sort of thing. I think that's it's kind of almost self-evident to do that now, but obviously a point to push home. But yeah, my main take home would be just get some reading goals. And Audible's really good, but try and buy books, physical books. Like we know, just with being able to retain the knowledge, reading it over and over, as well as listening, like you're going to retain it more, and you're going to be able to actually just sort of like rest on those ideas as well and go back to them and stuff. You don't have to sort of go and try and find your way back in your audio book. So yeah,
that's one thing. I listen to a lot of audio books, just an efficient way to consume content. But it's one of the things that I don't like is I can't easily go back and
you don't have the page number.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I mean for me, reflection I think is a big piece, and actually sitting down and taking the time. There's a couple of things that I didn't go into here around what. So one of the lines of thought that I had that we didn't discuss was why do people get so wound up in ideas? And I think if they don't have a sense of meaning and if they haven't taken the time to work out who they are and kind of what their purpose in life is, then they find meaning in an idea they think is valuable, and therefore they wrap their identity around that particular idea. And so again, they can't necessarily separate themselves from the idea, so therefore they can't separate somebody else from that idea, because their whole identity is wrapped up in the pursuit and progression of this particular ideology. Whereas if you have your own identity and this is what I think is the best way to move forward, you can separate yourself from that. So spend time, again, I'm big on, what are your personal values? What's your personal mission in life? What do you actually believe? And kind of do the groundwork to actually figure out who you are as a person. And then you can start, you are more able to separate yourself from ideas, and therefore be able to separate other people from their ideas. So that I think is the first one. And then reflecting on, so think about an issue that gets you agitated, or gets you passionate about it. And one kind of the emotional intelligence piece there that we didn't discuss as well. Are you aware of what emotions and what's triggering those emotions? Are you controlling those emotions, or are you kind of allowing yourself to get so worked up that you're going to have an amygdala hijack and your fight, flight, or fright or freeze system is triggered, and so you actually go on the attack physiologically, or are you controlling that? Spend a bit of time thinking about that sort of thing, and then also take the issue itself. What do I actually believe about this particular issue? What is it that makes me believe that? And then follow the progression of that idea. To its ends. Yeah, keep following it through, and sort of say, okay, I believe this. And so, I believe this because of that. And as a result of believing this, I think we should do this, this, and this. Okay, so what's the result of this? Why do I think we should be doing this? And where does that lead? If I pursue that for 6, 7, 8, 10 years, where am I going to end up? If I pursue that, what does that mean for all these other aspects? How does that integrate with the other aspects of my personality and character and family and society and all that sort of stuff. And then sit down and actually have a conversation with someone and say, and start it out and say, hey, I want to have a conversation with you. And I want to talk about the idea, right? This may be something slightly controversial, but I value our friendship. Let's talk about the idea.
Lay some ground rules.
I want you to challenge it. And actually have your idea challenged, and you can do it in a progressive way, right? Have someone that you're a friend with, and actually say, "Hey, I want you to challenge my ideas," and put that out.
So important.
And then you get used to talking about the idea and not the person. If you're doing it in a psychologically safe space,
and gaps in your thinking.
That's right. So they're highlighting that, and then you can kind of develop that thought. The whole process of just you verbalizing and talking about it, thoughts untangle themselves over the lips and through the fingertips. So you're forcing yourself to articulate your thoughts on the particular issue, which means that act of articulation is clarifying. So it clarifies your thoughts, which means you're more easily able to discuss them again in the future. And so once you've done that once or twice, actually sit down with someone that has a different viewpoint from you, and find someone in your network or your Facebook friends or something, and that you see that are on the opposite side of the spectrum on a particular issue, and actually sit down with them and say, hey, let's have a conversation. Let's only talk about the ideas. I'm not going to attack you. You don't attack me. Let's talk about the ideas. And I think the more that people do that, again, at the individual level, it starts to shift, and obviously in that, you're trying to understand, not to respond, and you're doing the active listening part that we were talking about before. And the more that people do that, I think the societal norm will shift back to kind of that civil discourse that is so important, and ultimately, as we said right at the beginning, lays the foundation for the democratic society in which we live.
Totally.
So
I think that's a good place to finish.
Good place to finish.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for the conversation, Lee.
Yeah, that was awesome. Really enjoyed that one.
Looking forward to the next one.
Absolutely. Hey guys, thank you so much for watching. If you're listening online or watched our video, we really appreciate your continued support.
We'd love to get some feedback from you. And so why don't you tell us what stood out to you the most? Put it in the comments box below. Don't forget to like, share it if you thought these were valuable conversations, and make sure you subscribe and hit the little bell button so that you know when the next conversation comes up online.